In the spring of 1291, the largest army Islam had ever assembled in generations marched on Acre, the last Christian stronghold in the Holy Land. Swelled by tens of thousands of soldiers and volunteers, this was not simply a siege, it was a reckoning, the final effort to erase the Crusader states from history. And Acre, once the jewel of the Latin East, now stood alone. For 2 centuries, the city had been at the heart of Christendom's struggle. Captured in 1104, it became the kingdom's great harbour, a landing place for pilgrims, a mustering ground for kings, and later, after Jerusalem fell, its capital. Here, the military orders built their fortresses, merchants crowded its markets, and for a time it seemed the dream of the Crusades might endure. But the balance of power was shifting. The rise of the Mamluk Sultanate transformed the war. Born from the slave soldier elite of the Ayyubids, the Mamluks forged a militant state built on discipline, faith, and siegecraft. Under Sultan Baybars, they dismantled fortress after fortress, until even the mighty Crac des Chevaliers fell in 1269. With each victory, the noose tightened. By 1289, Tripoli was gone. Only Acre remained. The spark came the next year, when Christian mobs massacred Muslim merchants in the city. Sultan Khalil seized upon the outrage to summon his armies, only to die before he could march. For a moment, Acre breathed a sigh of relief, but his son, al-Ashraf Khalil, swore to finish what his father began. By early 1291, the Mamluk host was on the move, converging on the last bastion of the Crusader states. This was not simply the siege of a city, it was the end of an age. By March 1291, the Mamluk host encircled Acre, the greatest force Islam had ever gathered against the Crusaders. From Cairo to Damascus, Aleppo to Hama, emirs and their levies answered Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil's call. At its core stood the elite Mamluk cavalry, Turkish-speaking slave soldiers trained from boyhood as master horsemen and archers, the finest warriors of their age. Around them thronged infantry, siege engineers, and thousands of volunteers, bound by faith and the promise of victory. Even remnants of the old Ayyubid nobility marched under Khalil's banner, alongside contingents from Syria, Palestine, and Bedouin tribes pressed into service. Their arsenal was terrifying. Nearly 100 siege engines, prefabricated in Damascus, were hauled across mountains and forests to the coast. Among them were colossal trebuchets, the Furious and the Victorious, each capable of hurling boulders heavier than a man. Miners from Aleppo tunneled beneath the walls, while Greek fire, clay grenades, and naphtha lay in waiting. When the kettle drums rolled across the plain, it was as though an empire itself had risen for war. Against this storm stood perhaps 14,000 to 17,000 defenders, fractured, leaderless, and divided. Yet in Acre, these rival orders and kingdoms now stood shoulder to shoulder, bound not by unity, but by desperation, knowing they were Christendom's final shield. The Templars under Grand Master Guillaume de Beaujeu held the northern gate. The Hospitallers under Jean de Villiers manned the central bastion of St. Anthony, and the Teutonic Knights under Conrad von Feuchtwangen waited in reserve. The Kingdom of Cyprus, commanded by King Henry II and his brother Amalric of Tyre, brought knights and infantry, bolstered by Venetian and Aragonese reinforcements under Jean de Grailly and Otto de Grandson. On April 6, 1291, the Mamluk drums began to beat, and the last battle for the Holy Land was underway. For weeks, Acre's walls trembled under bombardment. Under the terrified eyes of the defenders, colossal trebuchets began their work. For 7 days and nights, stones and fire rained upon the city without pause. Towers splintered, roofs collapsed, and the streets filled with rubble. The air itself seemed to shudder with each impact, while incendiary bombs set houses alight and drove smoke through the narrow alleys. The churches overflowed with the wounded, yet still the bombardment did not cease. The defenders did not sit idle. By night, the gates would suddenly open, and bands of knights charged into the Mamluk camps. Otto de Granson, Jean de Grailly, and others led daring sorties, cutting down sentries, setting fires, and sowing panic before retreating behind the walls. These raids bought precious time, but they could not alter the balance of power. The siege engines rolled ever closer, and the encirclement grew tighter with each passing day. At last, on May 18th, the Mamluks launched their final assault. Wave after wave surged against the walls, ladders and towers pressing forward beneath a storm of arrows and stones. On the Eastern Front, King Henry II of Cyprus and his brother Amalric fought desperately to stem the tide. Nearby loomed the Tower of the Accursed, one of Acre's tallest fortifications. Its capture would allow the enemy to command the walls with missile fire, and the Crusaders knew its loss would be catastrophic. At the northern gate, Guillaume de Beaujeu and the Templars resisted the armies of Hammer. For a time, they held firm, repelling every attempt to break through. But word soon reached Beaujeu that the Tower of the Accursed was on the brink of collapse. He personally led a detachment of Templars toward the breach, while the Hospitallers under Marshal Matthew de Clermont rushed to reinforce the position. The struggle raged for hours, but the pressure was unrelenting. At last, the Egyptians seized the tower. With its fall, the Templars and Hospitallers were driven back to the Gate of St. Anthony, severed from the Cypriot defenders at the eastern gate. In the confusion of retreat, disaster struck. An arrow pierced Grand Master Beaujeu. At first, men thought he had turned to flee, but he raised his arm and with his last breath declared, "I am not fleeing. I am dead. Here is the wound." Moments later, he was carried from the field, never to rise again. Not far away, Marshal de Clermont too was mortally wounded, fighting with equal valor. Leadership faltered. Jean de Villiers, the Hospitaller Grand Master, tried to rally his men at the Gate of St. Anthony, but he too was struck down and borne away by his followers. With their leaders gone and their defenses collapsing, the Crusader lines broke. The streets of Acre descended into chaos. Soldiers and townsfolk fled toward the harbor, flames rising as the enemy pressed in. At the docks, the remaining knights formed a desperate rearguard. Their sacrifice allowed King Henry, Amalric, Jean de Grailly, Otto de Granson, and the wounded Jean de Villiers to be hurried aboard ships and carried away to safety. But for thousands, there was no escape. The last survivors retreated into the Templar fortress under Marshal Pierre de Sèvres. For days they resisted, hoping for mercy. None came. When the Mamluks stormed the citadel, the defenders were cut down to the last man. The Fall of Acre marked the end. After nearly 2 centuries of war, the Crusader states in the Holy Land were no more. The Fall of Acre extinguished the last light of the Crusades in the Holy Land. Within weeks, the final coastal strongholds, Tyre, Sidon, and Beirut, were abandoned. The military orders retreated to Cyprus, their dream of reclaiming Jerusalem lost forever. For Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil, it was a triumph without equal. He rode through the shattered gates as the cross was torn down and the crescent raised over Acre's ruins. In Europe, prayers and promises echoed in vain. The age of the Crusades had reached its end.